Slavery, the treatment of human beings as property, deprived of personal rights, has occurred many times in human history. However, there is one institution that stands out for both its global impact and lasting legacy. The Atlantic slave trade occurred from the late 15th to the mid-19th century and spanning 3 continents, forcibly brought more than 10 million enslaved Africans to the Americas. The impact it would leave affected not only these slaves and their descendants, but the economies and histories of large parts of the world. There had been centuries of contact between Europe and Africa via the Mediterranean, but the Atlantic slave trade began in the late 1400s with Portuguese colonies in West Africa and Spanish settlement of the Americas shortly after. The crops grown in the New World colonies, sugar cane, tobacco, and cotton, were labor-intensive, and there were not enough settlers or indentured servants to cultivate all the new land. American natives were enslaved, but many died from new diseases and were killed off by invaders. And so, to meet the massive demand for labor, the Europeans looked to Africa. African slavery had existed for centuries in many forms. Some slaves were akin to indentured servants and were provided opportunities to gain freedom. Others were similar to serfs, and in some societies, slaves could own land or rise to positions of power. But when white captains came offering manufactured goods, weapons, and rum for slaves, African kings and merchants showed no hesitancy. They viewed the people they sold not as fellow Africans, but as unworthy criminals, debtors, and prisoners of war from rival tribes. By selling them, kings enriched their own realms and strengthened them against neighboring enemies. African kingdoms prospered from the slave trade, but meeting the Europeans' massive demand created intense competition. Slavery began to replace other criminal sentences, and capturing slaves became a motivation for war rather than its result. To defend themselves from slave raids, neighboring kings needed European firearms, which they also bought with slaves. In essence, the slave trade was an African arms race that altered societies and economies across the continent. As for the slaves themselves, they faced unimaginable cruelty and brutality as they were marched to slave forts on the coast, shaved to prevent lice, beaten into submission, branded and loaded onto European ships bound for the Americas. Roughly 20% of those enslaved would never see land again. Most captains of the day were tight packers, cramming as many men as possible below deck. While the lack of sanitation caused many to die of disease, others were thrown overboard for being sick or to instill terror. The captains ensured their profit by cutting off slaves' ears as proof of purchase. Some captives took matters into their own hands. Many inland Africans never seen white people before and thought them to be cannibals, constantly taking people away and returning for more. Afraid of being eaten, or just to avoid suffering, they committed suicide and starved themselves, believing that in death, their souls would return home. Those who survived were completely dehumanized and treated as mere cargo and later as property. Women and children were kept above deck and constantly abused and raped by the crew, while the men were made to perform dances in order to exercise or exhaust them to curb rebellion. What happened to those Africans who reached the New World and how the legacy of slavery still affects their descendants today is well known throughout the globe. But what is often not discussed is the effect that the Atlantic slave trade has had in the demise of Africa. Due to their participation, the continent lost millions of its able-bodied population, thus beginning the first of many brain drains. At the time, no concrete steps were taken to outlaw slavery in Africa. When the slave trade was finally outlawed in the Americas and Europe, African kingdoms whose economies had flourished would completely collapse, leaving them open to conquest and colonization. The increased competition and influx of European weapons fueled warfare and instability that continues to this very day. The transatlantic slave trade was also a major factor in the codification of racist ideology. Most African slavery had no deeper reason than legal punishment or prejudice due to intertribal warfare, but the Europeans who preached a Christianity which long ago outlawed enslaving fellow Christians used race as the justification of the practice. This stance was clearly at odds with the idols of equality preached. So, they claimed that Africans were biologically inferior and destined to be slaves, making great efforts to justify this phony theory. Thus, slavery in Europe and the Americas acquired a racial basis, making it impossible for slaves and their future descendants to attain equal status in New World societies. In all of these ways, the Atlantic slave trade was an injustice on a massive scale that continues to have a detrimental impact long after its destruction. This is the true history of the Atlantic slave trade.